Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. Even the most developed countries with extensive healthcare systems were left helpless when the coronavirus first struck. With cases now past 5 million worldwide, those countries that suffered early on have started to reopen as their infections and deaths eased. But if more advanced countries were unable to contain the initial outbreak, you can imagine what damage it could do to the most vulnerable. Places like Yemen have started seeing a steady rise in coronavirus infections, a situation the WHO warns could turn catastrophic. Having suffered 5 years of war, the country's fragile health system would be unable to handle an outbreak. Most of the cases are concentrated in Yemen's temporary capital, Aden. But with a lack of testing, no one truly knows how far and wide the virus has spread. And one of the largest refugee camps in the world recently confirmed its first case of COVID-19. Having been locked down in early April to prevent a potential outbreak, the Bazar refugee camp in Bangladesh is now on high alert. Home to more than 1 million Rohingya Muslims who fled persecution in neighboring Myanmar, health officials warn that cramped conditions at the camp are a perfect breeding ground for the virus. To discuss what is being done to help the world's displaced from Dhaka, I'm joined by Corliss, who is the UN Refugee Agency's representative in Bangladesh. So, Stephen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Tell us about what's happening in conflict-stricken and war-torn countries around the world, and how are they tackling with the coronavirus outbreak?
Well, this is the greatest level of displacement we've seen since the Second World War that we're grappling with already globally. And the coronavirus pandemic has only complicated our work. Here in Bangladesh, it's not a war-torn country, but it's a country that's hosting 860,000 Rohingya refugees. This is far smaller than the number of Syrians that Turkey is in fact hosting, but they're all living in a very small area, perhaps 20 square kilometers, and living in very fragile homes, very difficult to maintain social distancing. And of course, the demands of the pandemic are going to be tremendous for particularly healthcare. It was only a week ago that we had the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in the refugee camps, and today we're up to 21 cases. And that doesn't seem like a very large number in absolute terms, but we're definitely on the upward arc of the curve.
So how dangerous could this situation get?
Well, I think it could become very dangerous for the refugees and also the Bangladeshis living in nearby host communities. Actually, the number of cases in the host community is approaching 300. And when you hit that level, things can move very, very rapidly. The healthcare infrastructure is quite limited. At the beginning of the crisis, there were only 2 intensive care beds in the entire district, which is has a population of about 2.4 million people. And in the camp, of course, the healthcare system is quite basic. Although I would say one of the very best medical facilities that we have in the camp, and one with a surgical ward that treats 150, 500, 1,000 patients a month, is the Turkish field hospital provided by the government of Turkey. So this is really a tremendously important contribution that the people of Turkey are making to the Rohingya refugee crisis.
So on the other hand, over 300 refugees in early May floating adrift in the Bay of Bengal are now being held at an island where Cyclone Amphan has hit. Apparently, the government doesn't want to take them back to Cox's Bazar in fear of coronavirus spread. How are they holding up? Can you tell us about the extent of the damage there?
Well, I think the first thing to say is a positive thing, that the government of Bangladesh safely disembarked people from a vessel in distress at sea. UNHCR and the international community have urged the government to bring the people back to Cox's Bazar, to the camp, where services are available, the medical care they need, but also family and community networks are available. The island itself does not seem to have sustained major damage. The major part of the storm passed to the west of Bazaar, the island in the Bay of Bengal. There were high winds, there was some flooding, but the people appear to be well, although we have not had access to them. This is something that's expected to happen in the coming weeks.
So tell us about the obstacles you face in delivering aid and help scale back up the measures against COVID-19. Have you been forced to, in a way, scale back your activities currently?
Yeah, we've moved with the agreement of the government of Bangladesh. We've moved to what we call critical activities only. So this is the delivery of food, nutritional support, improvement of water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities, and most importantly, communicating with the communities. Information is really the first and most important line of defense against the coronavirus. But because of the scaling back to critical activities only, we have reduced the number of people going to the camp every day by 80%. So only 20% of the people who were going there to help in the past are going there now. And what is really making the operation still function are refugee volunteers. These are the Rohingya refugees themselves who play the most important role in delivering services, communicating with the community about how to protect themselves against coronavirus, where to go to seek medical care. And that is how we are now able to work, because over the past 2.5 years, we've made refugees really the central part of our operation.
Is it true that doctors are not allowed in camps and they give visual guidance to those already on the ground? And does it help?
No, I mean, we do continue to function. Just this week, UNHCR opened what we call SARI ITCs, that's Severe Acute Respiratory Infection Isolation and Treatment Centers. We're working toward a target of 1,080 beds in the camp. This will still be far lower than we actually need to meet the needs. We could have a need for as many as 10,000 beds at the peak of the pandemic. But just yesterday, we opened a 150-bed facility, a few days ago a 50-bed facility, and by June 15th, we hope to have 1,080 beds in place for isolation and treatment. So the medical personnel are really part of that critical team. Here on your screen, you can see that center going up. It is actually open, finished, and functioning as of yesterday.
So even the most developed countries are consumed with their own COVID-19 battle. Their economies took heavy blows. To which extent the international community's aid operations have been effective in helping the poor in general?
Well, so far, we haven't seen that impact. The funding decisions have been made in the past, but also for our special appeal for COVID-19, we received quite a strong support from the donor community. But we have to be concerned about what will happen in 2021 as economies contract, as the donor governments spend quite a lot on domestic stimulus, on employment, healthcare response in their own countries. There'll be less funding available for discretionary spending and for humanitarian operations. So this is something we really have to prepare for, and also make the case that the Rohingya here in Bangladesh and also displaced communities all around the world will continue to need humanitarian support.
If I'm not mistaken, UN's humanitarian fund for Yemen dropped dramatically to $800 million from last year's $2.6 billion. Which means 31 out of 41 crucial programs will shut down. So how will this impact this poor nation, and will the international community fail Yemen again?
Well, I'm not working in Yemen. It's a little difficult for me to comment, but I am aware that the funding shortfall is extraordinary, and that will have an impact on the ground, and that impact will be translated into the lives of people who need to be helped but won't receive the help they need. I can say that here in Bangladesh, over the past 2 years, since the beginning of the crisis, we've been well-funded. Well-funded means 70% of the total needs the last couple of years have been met. We hope that we'll receive that same level of funding in 2020, although it's also important to note that our actual needs are increasing with the coronavirus, as we have to create new healthcare facilities, put new teams on the ground, and step up our response.
So under these circumstances, in particular for Rohingya Muslims, which sustainable development goals are viable and matter the most to attain sustainable aid, maybe?
Well, I think all the sustainable development goals are important to displaced persons. That's actually the argument that we make, is it's so important for displaced populations and refugees to be mainstreamed within government responses to the sustainable development goals. So this is really what we try to do to shape our response, to make sure that we are part of national efforts to achieve the SDGs.
So what would be the consequences if these people are continued to be ignored, as we've seen for the last couple of years?
Yeah, well, I would say that I wouldn't say that the Rohingya refugees have been ignored. I would say that they received tremendous international support, but the thing they want more than anything else is to return to their country, Myanmar. So finding peace in Myanmar, creating the conditions for them to go home, to enjoy basic rights upon return. This is what's really needed. And of course, it's important for Bangladesh because it is a very, very important responsibility. I think Turkey has borne a huge responsibility for the Syrian refugees over the past few years. It's the same here in Bangladesh. And the Bangladeshi people have been very hospitable. But the Rohingya themselves will tell you that they want to go home, and they can see Myanmar. They can see their place they came from in the distance in the hills of Myanmar, and that's where they would like to go back. But of course, only when it's safe to do so. You're seeing the tragic pictures of the flight in August 2017 as people left from Myanmar fleeing for their lives. And they have found stability. They found relative peace in the camps in Bangladesh, but it's not a future for them to stay in refugee camps. The future must be for them to go home and rebuild their lives in Myanmar.
Do you believe that international pressure is being exerted on Myanmar to repatriate its citizens?
Well, there is quite a lot going on. I can just talk about UNHCR. We have an office in Mongdao. This is the area of return. Over there, we work with the United Nations Development Program and the government on projects in the villages where these people, who are refugees today in Bangladesh, came from, to try to rebuild the community relationships, to try to do quick impact projects to make it possible for people to go back. But fundamentally, it's a political issue. It's a political issue and an issue of governance within Myanmar, and that's going to take some time to solve.
All right, Stephen, thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk. Appreciate it a lot.
Thank you very much, and have a good Bayram.
This past week, the world passed another grim milestone, 5 million cases of the coronavirus. And now, as the US and many countries in Europe begin to ease their lockdowns, they are starting to ask, what went wrong? What caused the greatest global disruption since the Second World War? Already, blame is being pointed directly at the Chinese government. International backlash is growing against Beijing's initial handling of those crucial moments back in December, when the virus first emerged in Wuhan. Although the harshest criticism against China is coming out of the White House, many countries are now beginning to reconsider their economic ties to the world's largest exporter. Let's take a look at this report.
It has shut down the global economy. The constant. So just how severe could the growing backlash against China get? To discuss that from London, I'm joined by Xiaolan Fu, who is a professor at Oxford University, and from Istanbul, I'm joined by Altay Atli, who is a lecturer and researcher at the Asian Studies program at Bogazici University. Xiaolan, Altay, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you here. So why threats about decoupling and isolating China are grabbing headlines? The nation remains the world's biggest manufacturer, largest exporter, and largest consumer. So, Xiaolan, how realistic is it to break away from China's supply chain?
I think this is a trend that has already occurred before the pandemic, due to the rising protectionism and also nationalism in some of the countries, and also the trade war, mainly between the US and China. And this was enabled by the fourth industrial revolution, the digitization, and made it possible to some extent in some industries. However, to talk about this as a broad trend and like a fundamental decoupling from China, I don't think that will come true, because the basics of the economic rules, economics, were still working. So the profits, efficiency, and the large market of China, and the well-developed supply chains within China, all this will all come into play. So yes, there will be a balance.
There will be a balance. We also see international companies shifting production out of China to South Asian countries, as well as developing countries like Turkey, India, in order to optimize and diversify supply chains. So, Altay, what parameters do you think companies should consider as they reconfigure supply chains and their approach to international markets?
Sure. Well, first of all, the whole idea of supply chains is being rethought, revised, because supply chains, well, companies were working through supply chains in order to reduce their costs. But now we have seen with the coronavirus process, we have seen that this is also bringing risks, because the wider your supply chains are, well, fine, you are reducing costs, but at the same time, you are also increasing your risks. So in the period after the coronavirus, this will be the first item that the companies will prevent. How much risk can I take, and how much am I willing to reduce my cost? But the other thing is, of course, why are you investing overseas? Why are you investing in China? Now, if you are after low costs, China isn't a low-cost country anymore. For that, you need to go somewhere else. But China itself is changing as well. Now, China is investing in technology. China is climbing up the value-added ladder. So if you are after technology, if you are after sharing know-how and technology and so on, then China will still be a choice. So I think, well, we are entering a new period. Many countries will give up working with supply chains because simply the risks are now too high. But the thing is, of course, the whole concept of supply chains will remain in a modified way, maybe more regionalized, maybe more localized, and it will be a matter of your calculations of cost and benefit.
So where does this leave Turkey, in your opinion? Can Turkey benefit from the trade war between US and China when it comes to supply chains?
Well, I think that benefiting is not the right word, because we have entered a period that nobody is benefiting. Nobody is really benefiting from the trade war. Yes, maybe in the short term, sure, but not in the long term. Nobody in the long term. But Turkey can position itself like if the supply chains are regionalizing, if the new period is about creating clusters of supply hubs, Turkey can be a regional hub. So I'm not going to use the word benefiting, but it will be about repositioning yourself, and Turkey will be in a position to to take its place in this realigned global economy.
All right. Xiaolan, China's economy has experienced its fastest drop last quarter since 1992. How may this foreshadow what is to come for countries who are currently in the middle stages of the coronavirus outbreak?
China is deeply hit by the coronavirus in the first quarter. The growth rate was minus 6%. However, I think because of the very stringent quarantine measures introduced, they have been so far being able to control the situation, although we cannot predict whether there will be a second wave. And so people are working hard for the economic recovery. So crisis in Chinese means challenges, but also means opportunities. So I very much agree with the repositioning in the argument. So China also needs to use this opportunity to turn it as an opportunity to reposition it.
How will China do that? Because it's being criticized for not being open, for not being transparent. So will we see China more transparent in the coming future?
I think continue to open up and at a higher level of opening. I think this is a consistent message has been given by the Chinese government. They have a lot of motivation, reason to continue to do this because China benefited from globalization. So, and also the government now is emphasizing on the new infrastructure. The so-called new infrastructure is the infrastructure in digital technology for the next generation of technology, all the emerging technology, AI, artificial intelligence, blockchain, Internet of Things, etc., but including 5G too. So China is pushing, is upgrading through this way, and also recognize that there will be a kind of repositioning and also diversification of the value chain. So it should prepare for this more proactively by upgrading.
So we also see this pandemic exposed weak links in this globalization model, Altay. So there's a need, especially for countries, to rethink and readjust industrial layout. Xiao just mentioned the technology, but for example, for Turkey, where does this leaves Turkey?
Well, yeah, well, it's not the end of globalization, but we are entering a period of modified globalization or globalization version 2 or 3, whatever you want to call it. So this will be a period where countries will do two things, well, including Turkey, of course. First of all, if you don't want to be that vulnerable, you need to improve your own capabilities, in every area: technology, defense industry, energy, finance, whatever. So reducing dependencies on the outside world, being more self-sufficient. That's the first thing. But total self-sufficiency is impossible. It's it simply doesn't exist. So therefore, to the extent you depend on the other world, the other thing that the countries will be striving towards will be diversifying your partners. You won't want to diversify on one single partner in any given area, because that's vulnerability as well. That's what the countries have experienced when the coronavirus first hit China, and everybody was panicked because overexposure to Chinese market was a disaster for them.
Yeah, too reliant. Yes.
Yes. So two things. Globalization will continue, but interdependence, the idea of interdependence, will be rethought, and countries will make sure that they will reduce their dependencies by improving their own capacities. And the second thing is, to the extent you depend on the rest of the world, you will have to diversify so that if something goes wrong in one part of your portfolio, you just don't go down the hill like that.
So having mentioned dependency, Xiaolu, is it too early to make predictions for the future of the Belt and Road project, especially for Africa, where nations are tremendously under debt burden? What's going to happen next?
I think the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative is also affected by the pandemic. What I have heard from my fieldwork is that some of the investments have been not able to implement as planned because people's restrictions of people's movement. However, I think the Belt and the Road will still going on, maybe at a different scale, and also in China, people are talking about high quality Belt and Road. So if this is a Belt and Road initiative which is more inclusive, more sustainable, and also more with a lower level of risk for China. But there is a demand, like Africa country, like you said exactly. They need investment for the post-coronavirus economic recovery. So for the supply and the demand side, there are the both sides that still interest meets each other. So the Belt and Road will still move forward, but I think it will be at different scale, and also the quality and the risk control will be a very important item in the consideration.
All right, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it here. Xiao, Altay, thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk. Appreciate it a lot. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberkaş. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with the hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.